being here. It's a pleasure and privilege. I can't tell you how gratifying it is to have the support. I was told this was a very big room. They were not exaggerating. Anyway, I feel like I just went from a house to a hotel. I was like walking a few short steps. I'll admit that when I was thinking about this run and envisioning what the campaign would look like, one of the visions I had was being on the national debate stage and imagining all of the Asian American boys in particular who would look up and see someone of our community on the debate stage, and that vision gave me a lot of pride and joy, and I'm so glad that that vision came to pass. And that was 5 debates ago. And now, sometime over the next several days, I believe we're going to qualify for the 6th debate. I'll be one of only 7 candidates to do so, and perhaps the only person of color on the debate stage that day in Los Angeles on December 19th. And that wouldn't be possible if not for you all embracing this campaign and seeing that we have to contribute more to the future of this country. I'm very proud to be the first Asian American man to run for president as a Democrat. And raise your hand if you've been really actively involved with politics before this point. So anyone who has your hand up, you are extraordinary, and I appreciate you for it. The fact is, politics was not something that was discussed when I was growing up in my household. Like, I don't remember my family ever even talking about a particular political race. Certainly, it was not impressed upon my brother and me that we should consider running for office at some point in the future. My brother's a professor now at NYU. My father worked in industry and then became a professor the last number of years. My grandfather's a professor, my uncle's a professor. You guys get a sort of theme here. And I believe that many Asian Americans look at politics as something that's not really for us. And if you look at the numbers, Asian Americans vote at lower levels in other communities. We donate money at lower rates in other communities. Present company accepted, of course, because I know you all donated a lot to be here today. And we certainly run for office at lower levels than other communities. We're 5.6% of the U.S. population, but we actually are not demonstrating even that level of engagement or prominence in our politics. And I believe that needs to change. I think that my parents came here for the same reason many of you came here, your parents came here, which is to create a better life for their family. And it certainly worked out for my family. My parents met as graduate students at UC Berkeley. Anyone here go to Berkeley? There might be someone. Your daughter's at Berkeley? That counts, you're a Berkeley parent. Your dad also counts. And maybe they knew my parents. So my brother is named after the Lawrence Observatory at Berkeley. So we used to joke that they must have had a lot of fun at that observatory. But their experience, I believe, mirrors the experience of many people here in the room, where we came to this country to create a better life. And it's worked for me and my brother. Now I'm not just a father to 2 little boys, but also my brother just had his first child, so now I'm an uncle as well. And so when you start looking forward, you realize that we've gained so much from coming to this country, and it's time for us to give back. And I'm going to go a step further and say that this country actually needs us to get more involved and to contribute at the highest possible levels, because we understand some of the things that are happening in this country in a way that, for whatever reason, the other politicians do not. Yes. And I think a lot of it is that most of the other politicians know very, very little about technology. Most of them even don't know much about business and the economy, unfortunately. And a lot of the problems that are now growing and manifesting are a result of the way technology and business are intersecting. Whereas someone, how many of you all run a business? I get the sense that a number of you have. So if you run a business, you understand that we have certain incentives with the business And increasingly, in order to run an effective business, you have technology doing more and more of the work and people doing less and less. I was talking to an entrepreneur who'd started a business, and he was fascinated by the fact that when he'd started a business 10 years ago, he would have to pay a bookkeeper, he would have to pay various people to do aspects of the job. He says, now I did like payroll, HR. He's like, now I just subscribe to Gusto. I just subscribe to this thing. I just pay them $80 a month. And what would have been a job or a part-time job at a minimum, now is just this software service to the cloud. That if you run a business, you know that this is going to end up having a really extreme impact on many American workers, and our politicians don't understand the problem well enough to even talk about it, much less solve it. If this problem goes unsolved, I believe it's going to be disastrous for all Americans, including Asian Americans. Because right now, in American life, who's being presented as one of the big boogeymen or rivals coming up? China. I think someone did a study where they tried to figure out the positive to negative press mentions about China, and it will probably surprise no one in this room to hear that the negative outweigh the positive by something like 10 or 20 to 1. And at this point, this is even bipartisan. You know, it's like if certain administrations or certain officials decide to poke at China, you don't see the other side defending China. You know, that unfortunately we're migrating towards increasing tensions with China. And I think another big byproduct of my campaign can be, number one, to demonstrate to Americans that Asian Americans are just as American as anyone else. Yeah. And number two, to hopefully push us into less of a zero-sum game mentality where China and Asia are concerned. Because right now, the American default stance is that if someone else is doing better, then maybe that's bad for us. We should do something to keep them down. And that, to me, is going to lead to increasing tensions in very negative ways with China in particular. And the goal has to be to build a different kind of relationship that will enable us to solve some of the biggest problems that concern us all, including climate change, artificial intelligence, geopolitical concerns like North Korea that we need to work together on. These are some of the bigger problems that, to me, are more pressing than some of the other things that are causing tension and conflict. And even if you have relationships where you do have differences and conflict, and this is true in person-to-person and personal relationships, and I believe it can be true in international relationships, you can disagree strongly on some things, but then still maintain a relationship that enables you to get other things done. And I know that many people here in the room supporting a non-Republican might be something new, which I appreciate a great deal. Oh, it's cool. But that's what I mean. It's like you can see that you might disagree with someone on some things, but then you have bigger pictures in mind. And so it's true for people. It can be true for societies and countries as well. Many of you are here today because you're excited to support me in the campaign, Asian American candidate for the next generation. I appreciate that a great deal. But I want you to get a little bit more ambitious. I want you to see that we can win this whole race. Because we can. We can, and it's in the numbers. I've looked at the numbers quite deeply. I have a math lapel pin. It's sort of, if I don't look at the numbers, then someone will have to tear this pin off me. So, the numbers show that this is the most fluid and dynamic race that anyone's seen in generations. Now, many of you are relatively new to American politics, or new to presidential politics, let's say. But the majority of early state voters say they're still open-minded, and even if they say they've chosen a candidate, they say they could change their mind. And this is highly unusual at this stage. The race that this is closest to is 2004. John Kerry was at 4% at the end of 2003, and he ended up winning the nomination. Some of you are old enough to remember the front runner at this time in that cycle was Howard Dean. Howard Dean was you remember the Dean scream, the rest of it? He was the leader in December of 2003. John Kerry was at 4%, and then John Kerry ended up rising in the polls. We're going to also rise in the polls in the days to come. And I can just about guarantee that. So this isn't like Andrew Yang like hopes he's going to rise the polls. No, that's not the way this works. It's math. We've gotten to 4% in the early states and around the country with zero paid advertising. Highly, highly unusual. We just spent millions in paid advertising in the early states starting about 3 weeks ago. And it takes 3 to 6 weeks for the advertising to show in the polls. So when I say we're going to rise in the polls, that's just a statement of fact. The only way that would not be true is if somehow millions of dollars in advertising had negligible impact, which is almost unheard of in politics. So if you see other people rise in the polls, it's generally a product of lots of money being spent. We have gotten to this point without spending a dime on paid advertising, but now, thanks to people like you, we're about to go and fight fire with fire and spend millions of dollars to make sure that the people in Iowa and New Hampshire know exactly who Andrew Yang is and what my vision for the country is. Oh, thank you. Oh, good thinking, Ryan. So we're going to rise in the polls, and as we rise in the polls, all of these people who are up in the air about who to support are going to give us a second look, and then they're going to realize, wait a minute, he's talking about the issues that affect me and my family, he's talking about ways to actually help move the country forward, and this is what many of them say that they're looking for. When they come and give Andrew Yang a look, they're going to see that I'm the best candidate to take on Donald Trump and win in 2020 because I'm drawing in people like here in this room who are not hardcore Democrats, but also independents and Republicans and libertarians and conservatives who are concerned about Donald Trump. In New Hampshire, a poll came out that said that I was one of only 2 Democrats that 10% or more of Donald Trump voters would support in the general election. Another poll came out that said that 20% of college Republicans would choose me over Trump. And the math is, if you get 10 to 20% of Donald Trump voters, you win if you're the Democrat. And the #1 criteria the Democrats have for the nominee is who can beat Donald Trump. You see how it fits together? So with the resources that you are providing, we're going to make this case to the voters in Iowa, New Hampshire. We're going to introduce them to me, my vision for the country, and my family. And you're going to see our numbers rise. You're going to see the press have no choice but to cover this campaign on a much higher level. This is like a very, very inside scoop, but we just got word that one of the major networks is assigning a full-time embed to the campaign, which they only reserve for major contenders. Like Chris understands what it means. So some of the major networks are figuring out that I am the candidate on the rise, #5 and growing. I've already outperformed half a dozen senators, governors, and congresspeople, but that is not enough. The goal is not to run a race to be proud of. The goal is to win. And I want you to see that we can win this whole thing. If we have the resources, if we're able to compete at the same level as the other candidates on the airwaves, we can 100% win this whole race. I'm going to give you some context about where we are. Texas, this time, you all will actually have a voice in the presidential race. Excuse me. Because the race is not going to be resolved by the time you guys all start voting, which is highly unusual for you. Most of the time, by the time it gets to you, it's pretty much already done. No, truly. But this time, Super Tuesday, you're essentially the equivalent of state #5. For those of you who are new to politics, what's the first state to vote? Iowa, that's right. What's the second? New Hampshire. There's a tricky one. What's the third? Nevada. It's tricky. And then #4 is South Carolina. And then you're not going to believe this, but you all are next. Texas is #5, along with a bunch of other states. So I can guarantee you that this race will not be resolved by the time it comes to Texas. It's still going to be up in the air. And by the time it comes to you, your votes can actually help change the course of history. I have a feeling we know who you're going to vote for. And we need you to spread the word, not just in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina. Those people are actually very important. If you have friends in those places, don't be able to reach out to them and be like, hey, it's been a while. Have you heard of Andrew Yang? But then here in Texas too, if you spread the word, that also could make a big difference because the Super Tuesday states are going to be crucial. I said last night at Gillies, this is like a relay race where it's like the baton gets passed from state to state. So the baton starts in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, and then it will come right here to Texas. This is a new development because of the fact that this race is going to be so up in the air. And our challenge is growing quickly enough, fast enough, because we only have 7 weeks. We only have 7 weeks until the voting starts. And in Iowa, we have people coming in from all over the country. How many of you are actually going to come up to Iowa and candidates? No, I didn't expect any hands to go up, but there are a couple of people on the back. So Iowa's so key that next week, I'm going to be doing a 14-stop bus tour for 5 days. And if you're not into politics, you're not going to believe it, but this is how it works. You rent a giant bus, and then you cover it with your own graphics. So this is like the Gang Express. We didn't call it the Gang Express. It was like a New Way Forward bus tour. And then you bring dozens of reporters on the bus with you, and then you go from place to place, and you get out, and you talk to Iowans, and you all get back on the bus, and the reporters go. This is like a giant political ritual. My wife's going to join me for part of the tour. To give you a sense of the numbers, we need to, this will be like a quick math political thing. Iowa has a population of 3.1 million people. What percentage of Iowans do you think voted in the Democratic caucus in 2016? 5.7%. That's right. So you think, oh, like how can Andrew Yang become president of the United States? It's actually a very straightforward math problem. We have to get about 50,000 Iowans on board with a vision of an economy that works for them. Because about 200,000 are going to vote. So you're not talking about reaching everyone in the state of 3.1 million. You're talking about homing in on the 5 or 6% that are actually going to caucus. That's why something like the bus tour matters. That's why every dollar you give in terms of advertising matters. That's why calling your old school chum who happens to live in Iowa matters. Because any person in Iowa and New Hampshire can actually move the ball forward and help us win this whole race. I'm really proud of being the first Asian American candidate. And a story I tell about something that shaped me in this is that my dad worked for IBM for a dozen plus years. He worked for GE and then IBM. He generated 69 US patents over his career. When I was really small, I thought that everyone's dad had a PhD. I learned the hard way that they did not. I was like, hey, what's your dad's PhD? And they were like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what I said. And then when I got a little older, I figured out what a patent was, and I went to my dad and I said, hey, Dad, how much money do they give you when you generate a patent? I thought it was going to be a lot. And he said, oh, $200 or $300. And I was like, that doesn't seem like enough. And then he said, well, they're also paying my salary so I can house, feed, and clothe you and your brother. And then I said, oh, I understand how it works. But then one time I came home and he was really angry. And I said, Dad, why are you so mad? And he said, at IBM, when you can't invent anymore, they make you a manager. And so he said his lab consists of white managers and Asian engineers in the lab. And I heard that story and I was like, oh my gosh, is that right? I was 14 years old. And the impression that left with me is an impression that many of us have had at some point during our lives, which is that in the United States of America, Asian Americans are allowed to become this successful, but we are not allowed to become this successful. I learned that relatively young, but I am saying to you all this morning that we can change that right now if we fight our hearts out to compete at the highest possible levels and show the rest of the country that we can not just succeed, but we can lead and contribute to this country in the most patriotic ways possible. Thank you all so much.
So the first question we'd like to ask you is, what do you see as the biggest challenge for the Asian American community in the new political environment?
Asian Americans are not front and center in American political life right now. And there's only one way to change that, and it's for us to step up. It's to donate money at events like this one. It's to run for office. It's to vote. It's to tell our kids that, hey, politics actually is important and matters. A high-level official told me that right now Asian Americans are regarded as a low-level ATM. That we're just like a low-level source of money, and we don't really ask for that much. And we have to be better than that. Now, there are a number of structural reasons why we are a political afterthought. One is that we tend to live in blue or red states, like Texas. If we all lived in New Hampshire, they would think about us very differently. So what I want you all to do is to pack your bags and move to New Hampshire sometime between now and February 11th. Get that residence very, very quickly. The only way we can start to meaningfully impact American politics, not even American politics, but Texas politics or Plano politics. I tell people, when I meet someone who runs for local office, I admire them so much, and I tell them very honestly that running for local office is in some ways a bigger commitment than running for president. Because when you run for local office, everyone knows who you are, everyone knows where you live, you know, they see you shopping. If you don't show up to the local thing, they're like, where were you? It's an incredibly high level of commitment. And the more Asian Americans that run for local office, state office, who donate, who get engaged, who go to events that aren't necessarily geared towards our community, like those things are very, very positive. So that's how we actually gain a voice politically. It's through events that, like this, but not just this sort of fun event in the fanciest house I've been in quite some time. And I've been to a lot of fancy houses. But also like the nitty-gritty community work, the run for local office, the unglamorous stuff. It's not something that we can remedy overnight, but if we work really hard, we can actually increase our voice and also let our kids know that this is very, very important for our future.
Thank you. That is all we have time for. Let's give a warm round of applause.